So good evening, everyone. Welcome to another Monday night training session hosted by Div 176 here in Victoria. My name is Nick Hume. I'm a provincial staff officer with St. John in BC. I do a lot of work with the training department here in Victoria, and I do a lot of other stuff as well. Joining us tonight is Bobby Bennett. Bobby's a medic with the 11th Field Ambulance, Canadian Armed Forces, and is also a triage nurse with Island Health at both Royal Jubilee Hospitals and I believe now also at Victoria General. So she's got lots of experience dealing with injury or medical priority stratification and MCI and triage sort of stuff. And she's going to be talking to us for the next hour and a half on this. As we usually do, guys, I'm going to keep everyone muted and keep everyone's cameras off. Or ask everyone to keep their cameras off while Bobby's talking. That's specifically so that we can have a clean recording of this. I see a couple of you unmuting yourselves after I've remuted you. Please just sit tight and keep the microphones off while Bobby's presenting, unless she's asked us for some input. I understand there might be a few pauses throughout the presentation tonight. Asking for feedback or input from the group. As always, if you have questions, please feel free to put them into the typed group chat. I will be monitoring that. I'll be sort of curating the questions and delivering those to the group, or pardon me, from the group to Bobby at the end. If there's anything really critical or urgent, please try and flag it, and I can, if it's really time sensitive or critical to understanding, I can maybe interrupt the presentation, but otherwise we're going to try and save everything till the end. And with that, I'm going to mute myself here, and I'm going to hand you guys over to Bobby. I'm going to unmute. I'll Bobby. Yeah, there you go, guys. Thanks so much, Bobby.
Thank you guys very much for having me. I appreciate the chance to speak. I do have kind of a complicated career background in as far as I get bored very easily, and I work 6 jobs, one of which is Canadian Armed Forces. My position there is the clinical teaching instructor for the medics with 11 Field Ambulance. I also work with the search and rescue technicians through the JIBC. I'm their clinical instructor as well. And I work at both, as Nick said, Victoria General and Royal Jubilee Hospitals. I also work rurally and in outpost positions in northern BC. And occasionally moonlight as an anesthetic nurse as well. So a big chunk of, so I've triage experience, particularly from the emergency room. A big chunk of the disaster management and mass casualties experience that I have actually came from being sent on exercise. I was one of the lucky 4 Canadians who was sent onto the Mercy, which is the American naval hospital ship. We went on an exercise called Pacific Partnership to Southeast Asia. We went to Malaysia, Sri Lanka, Vietnam, and Okinawa, and did basically multi-country, up to 12-country kind of symposiums on disaster management and mass casualty scenarios. And I was lucky enough to take part in several Code Orange mass casualty exercises. As I was telling Nick earlier, I personally, I'll admit, have been part of all of 2 mass casualties, neither of which was that severe. I've been around a lot of people who have experience, who've taught me, but I haven't personally managed to land myself into anything too overwhelming besides all the exercises we do in the military. It's entirely possible one of you guys has potentially more actual experience than me. So I'm going to open the floor to questions sometimes, just in case we've got people out there who've got good stories. What I want to specify is, as soon as I say mass casualties, most people think about disasters. This is an incredibly wordy definition of disaster by the World Health Organization. the most important part essentially being that it implies that it's not manageable. I want to specify we're not talking necessarily about natural disasters. We're not talking about the event itself, but specifically mass casualties. So what is mass casualties? If I'm going to, again, open the floor for questions. When I say mass casualties, what does that bring to mind for you?
This would be a good time, folks. If you want to unmute yourselves and chat, please go ahead, or just type stuff into the chat.
I guess I think of a mass casualty as a large event with many patients of differing injuries, such as a plane crash, bus crash.
Yep.
I see one person here, Mike Hoskinson, has typed in more victims than responders. Alan McIsaac has added anytime there are more casualties than there are responders. Patricia Brewer from 518 just said 911. I guess she's suggesting 911 services often deal with mass casualties.
Exactly, and that's really where I'm going with this, is that essentially mass casualties is when you have enough casualties to overwhelm your resources. So what are your resources? It's completely dependent. Everyone kind of thinks of different things. When I was on deployment in Vietnam, they get floods and building fires. Those are the two most common for them. Whereas for Sri Lanka, it was tsunamis. And we had the Peruvian military there, and they have massive landslides and earthquakes and floods that they deal with consistently. That's different kind of where our background is here. Obviously, we get the forest fires in the summer. In America, it's more common to have mass shootings than it is in a lot of other countries, which it's all can be considered mass casualties because it's just what overwhelms you. Now, if you're doing, let's say, event medicine, which I know is something that you guys do fairly frequently, and let's say there's 2 of you, 4 of you, how many people does it take, how many casualties does it take to overwhelm your resources? It can happen pretty quickly. Particularly in the emergency room, everybody thinks that they imagine the emergency room is magically emptied out and that we can handle that whole emergency room full of casualties. But generally speaking, we've got 1, 2 beds open. We can really, if we have to, shift 4 or 5 people. So it only takes 5 critically ill people to constitute mass casualties in an emergency room in Victoria, because you still get everybody in that's having all the usual problems. Just because there's been a tsunami doesn't mean someone's not going to have a heart attack or not going to have a baby. A lot of the time, whatever situation has happened can actually initiate those things. And those are the people that you kind of forget about. So it's not, these aren't something you see coming, and they're not something you can really prepare for. So what I'm hoping to come out of this presentation is not for specifics so much as having been involved in a lot of different exercises and a lot of different attempts to prepare for this if this happens. Obviously, Vancouver Island, we're very tsunami conscious, is how you can prepare yourself and what you can do, knowing that you're potentially going to find yourself in a situation that you absolutely can't control. It's the entire point of this, is that it's not something that isn't going to be chaotic. So I'm kind of going at this from a case study perspective. Theoretically, your medical coverage at a bike race, I'm thinking Tour de Victoria is kind of what popped to mind. You know, in the front of the Parliament buildings, when it gets super busy, I'm sure you guys are familiar. You've got tents everywhere, you've got the plastic fencing, and the police have closed off all the roads coming up to where the event is going to be. And in our theoretical situation here, something right in the middle of the lawn where everybody is catches fire and explodes. Obviously, you don't know what has caused said explosion. It could be a mechanical accident or an electrical accident. It might be on purpose. It's not something that's unheard of either. So what's the first thing that you do? anyone have like what leaps to mind as the immediate thing you do when this happens?
Mike Hoskinson's noting secure the scene. Alan McIsaac's commented scene safety. I would, depending on what Mike means by secure the scene, I'd buy into that pretty heavily as well. Call for more help from Ken Swain. Stay calm from Patricia Brewer. Call 911 from Kevin Kurtz. It's actually a pretty contact whoever has more resources.
Yes.
I think to me, I jump in with the scene safety, right? Like until you know what's going on, certainly for us, you know, scene safety and making sure us and our colleagues are safe is a pretty big one.
You guys are ahead of me. That's the first thing here. A lot of people want to go rushing headlong into that situation. That's especially for people who are in a position where we feel it's our responsibility, our duty to be looking after these people. Even in a good example that I recently saw during the COVID crisis, when the paramedics would bring in patients who were in active cardiac arrest into the emergency room, we all had to get completely dressed up into our airborne gear if we suspected they had COVID, which takes 3 minutes. And for anyone who's been doing CPR, 3 minutes while you're doing CPR is a very long time. And it was too much for several of the nurses and in several instances, some of the doctors who weren't willing to take the time to put the gear on and just went into the trauma room to start things and to start helping. And you can see why they would want to do that. But if you consider the fact that if they then get COVID and they spread COVID to their coworkers, that we're then taking healthcare providers out of the situation, and you are an incredibly valuable resource. If you think about what we talk about mass casualties is when the resources are overwhelmed by the casualties. If you take your resources out, you're making that situation so much worse. You have to, as somebody said, stay calm and remove yourself from that situation for a second. You need to back away from it. In this case, it's an explosion. You need to be away from where that explosion is. Something else might go off. This may have been done on purpose. There may be another one. Or in the case of one of the things I wanted to touch on, because we get a fair bit of training in it, the military, active shooters, it is not helpful to find yourself helping people until that shooter has been secured. It's something that you see quite a bit in the mass shootings in the States and in military settings where people try and go help and then become casualties themselves. And especially with terrorism being what it is now, you will see the shooter actually go for medical personnel on purpose because it's horrid for morale. We saw that in several of the military operations that we were doing in the Middle East. Many countries are getting to the point where in certain situations, the medics aren't wearing that Red Cross anymore. If you're out there and you've got your St. John's ambulance uniform on, that could potentially make you a target, and you need to consider that. And the calmer you can be, just by remaining calm alone, you can control that situation around you. That's one of the first things you need to do. I think you guys covered all of those points. And then communication. This is always going to be chaos. These situations aren't controllable. You have to do the best you can with what you have. And scene safety, communication are things that you always hear. They're things we often don't take into consideration, things we think we're going to do really well with the moment that things start happening. And they're often things that we fail at and that we forget to do. You need to be consistently checking back with your team members, checking back with people that you have enlisted to help you. You need to be using closed loop communication. I assume you know what that is, but what I mean by that is if you say something to someone, that person then repeats it back to you. Like, I'm going to go to do this. Okay, you're going to go do that. I'm going to go do this. You need to, and it's one of those things we practice when we do our first aid courses or our ACLS courses. We feel silly when we're doing it, but situations will fall apart. if you don't have that communication. And in these instances, you have to also take into consideration, when I say lines of communication, what do you have? You have cell phones? Do you have radios? If you're there and there's a police officer near you, they have contact with the other emergency services. Like, who have you got near you that you can put onto comms? And then keeping those comms open as well. Did you call 911 once, or do you need someone to stay on the phone and continue updating them? Taking into consideration that how many people out of that incident that we talked about are going to be calling 911 all at once, and giving them different pieces of information. So you need to be very clear and concise with what you are telling them as well. Finding your resources. This is something I know in the military and the search and rescue technicians you get very creative about, because you often don't have resources on hand. And I would imagine you potentially find yourself in situations like that as well. I don't know what your guys' med bags look like, but I know they're not as heavily implemented as, say, the military's would be. If you look at pictures of some of the mass shootings in, like the one in the States that happened last year, everyone's wandering around without shirts on. Why are they wandering around without shirts on? It's because they've all taken their shirts off to use as bandages. If you don't get water bottles, particularly the water bottles that you can squeeze through the mouthpieces to help irrigate wounds, so you can see where the bleeding is coming from. Anything, like any piece of twine or rope or whatever you can use to help put pressure on a wound, you have to start getting creative. One good story about this is they had a chemical incident in one of the field hospitals in the Middle East that some of my captains were on, and they were giving everybody Ventolin. Because people's airways were not maintaining themselves very well, and they ran out of nebulizers. So what do? So they got bike pumps, and they hooked the bike pumps up to the face mask and pumped the air through in order to nebulize Ventolin into people. Or using oxygen tubing if you've got somebody that, this is a little bit advanced, but if you're going to intubate somebody and you don't have an OG tube, if you take oxygen tubing and you pop the end off, you put the roll and push the oxygen tubing down next to that tube, you can use that in an instant as an OG tube. Even up to one of the Canadian surgeons, this I thought was really cool. There was in Afghanistan, I believe, a soldier who had the majority of his leg blown off by an IED, and they couldn't get him to the role for in Germany quickly enough. They were going to have to remove the leg because one of his arteries was completely severed. This physician took a Foley catheter and sutured it to each end of the artery and actually managed to get pulses back and saved his life. So when you're in these situations, just because the textbook says don't put the oxygen tubing down, like obviously we're working within your scope of practice and you're not endangering people, but sometimes you really have to pull out all the tools that you've got and think really creatively. In this kind of situation, bystanders. How many of your bystanders work in the medical field or know first aid, or for that matter, are just willing to help, as opposed to taking all of your, it's so easy to, we call it going into the black, tunnel vision is another word for it, and to try and do everything yourself. For anyone who's been in an emergency situation, you know what I mean. You have to take yourself back a step and ask for help for the people around you. And then you have to, again, communicate with them very clearly, particularly if they're not medically trained. Now, as far as when I say organize your workspace, I know that there's different words for the same thing, whether you're looking at disaster management or military or pre-hospital medicine. We call it a casualty collection point. But essentially what you need to do when, as I say, don't go running into that fray. You also don't want to be moving yourself around a whole bunch. You're going to waste your resources. What you need to do is make yourself visible and if at all possible, set up an area where casualties will be seen, as opposed to trying to go out and get to those people yourself. If you have enough people, ideally, you can send someone out to get them, but people, if you make yourself visible, will start coming to you. They'll start bringing people to you. So if you're out St. John's Ambulance, the nice thing is you guys have your uniforms and you've got your ambulance, so you're going to make yourself fairly visible as is. One of the big tips here that seems simple, but definitely really helps, is creating bottlenecks. Like, you have that snow fencing out at these events. If you have to use some of that, or you have to use tables, make it so people can't just wander in and out of your space at leisure. You want to have an in route and an out route. If you've got tape, hockey tape, medical tape, duct tape, and make arrows pointing to show which way is in, which way is out, and create kind of a flow. We do the same thing in the emergency room. You can control a great deal more of that chaos. It doesn't take fancy equipment to design to make it so that that's how it works. Again, ideally, if you can have somebody at those in and out points as well. If the person at the in point is, as we'll get to, the person triaging, generally speaking, or can triage, that's helpful. And then creating, if at all possible, within that space, different areas for different types of casualties. And we're going to get into this, actually, just, I guess, out of interest sake. The picture on the right is a casualty collection point during a mass casualty exercise in Vietnam that we did with the American Coast Guard and the American Navy. And you can see that we've got bathtubs, and the blue things beyond are boats. That's what the Vietnamese have, these little bowl-shaped boats they make, because the casualties, the theoretical casualties we had, got covered in oil and we needed to decontaminate them. And so we just pulled what we had, which turned out to be an old bathtub and a couple boats, so that we would have multiple wash areas where we could get the motor oil off people. So a couple things, I got this from the World Health Organization. Some of it I knew and some of it I didn't. Many of the deaths following disasters are preventable. People who are going to die right away tend to die right away, right? Without meaning to sound callous. Generally speaking, someone who's completely overwhelmed by their wounds will have wounds of such a severity that there's not much you can do about it. After that, research has shown that the majority of people with simple interventions, given they're timely and appropriate, can actually be saved. And that pre-hospital aspect of things is incredibly important for this. We have a tendency in TV shows and kind of pop culture to really focus on the emergency room, but as you guys know, so much of the really important things happen before then. And this is where it's going to be really important for you to take into consideration that you can start that search and rescue and search and rescue in as far as getting people to the casualty point, and that early triage can make a huge difference between who emergency services takes to the hospital first. So you're in a very, very critical position as far as needing to make those decisions and needing to work with emergency services on who to take first and who's the priority. And this is the one that I had kind of found interesting, and I suppose I knew it, but I had never actually read it before. Most casualties during a disaster are not medical. Now, this I have encountered, and I'm sure some of you have as well. But what do we mean by non-medical casualties? The walking worried. Probably heard the walking wounded before. That's your your green. When you're triaging somebody, it's the person who's walking around with something relatively minor. But you've got people who are completely uninjured, who are just scared. They don't know where to go. They don't know what to do. They don't want to leave the situation. And so they'll often be the first ones to approach you. They'll also frequently be people who can attract a lot of your attention, because they're at this point able to get up. They're able to attract your attention. They're They're able to tug at your sleeve. They're able to talk to you. Not that they don't need and deserve care, but they can be a dangerous distraction for other people who may not be able to speak for themselves, who are maybe more seriously injured. We had a mass casualty exercise at one point in my unit, and one of my sergeants did a fantastic job of making himself an absolute nuisance to one of our corporals who was trying really hard to triage people and pull casualties out of the incident that we created. And he just shouted and called it corporal holiday, just kept shouting louder and louder, and made a very good point of what can happen when somebody does lose the ability to control themselves properly, which will happen to a lot of people in these situations. And so generally speaking, though, you're going to get inundated with these non-medical people, and you need to recognize who they are. And that's part of the reason I talked about separating your medical area into spaces. You don't want these people in with your wounded or your people who need immediate care. So where do you put them? Right? If you just make a little space and you're thinking to yourself, okay, I'm going to have people who are bleeding, I'm going to have people who need this or people who need that, where are you going to pile this gigantic group of panicking people? What are you going to do with them? So it's something to think about. So I don't know, I know again, you guys are of mixed backgrounds. Some of you may know how to triage, some of you may have an idea of triage. I'm going to start basic for anyone who doesn't and get more complicated as we go. Triage just literally is from the French word to sort. And it actually initially came from Napoleon. So Napoleon was one of the first military leaders, or one of the only military leaders at his time, who started really focusing on his troops and prioritizing them above his officers. He, for instance, started the army tradition where officers in the army, in the Canadian Army at any rate, serve the food to the soldiers, and once the soldiers have eaten, then the officers can eat. Napoleon started that because there wasn't always quite enough food, but the people out doing the really hard work, the ones digging the trenches and the ones fighting, were the ones who needed the food. And so he made sure that they had food, and this is part of the reason he was so successful. One of his head physicians was the one who came up with the idea that you would start taking casualties depending on their wounds, depending on what kind of attention they needed, as opposed to nationality, to rank. And then you could use this strategically to get people back to the battle. I thought this quote from the American College of Emergency Physicians was interesting as well. Triage is often referred to as doing the greatest good for the greatest number. They specify that it's a process. And when you apply this process, it creates the situation that allows for doing the greatest good for the greatest number. So there are quite a few different forms of triage. If you've worked in the emergency room, if you work in the hospital, you know what I mean. One of the most widely used in hospital systems is the one that we use in Canada. Actually, it was created by Canadian and Australian physicians, I believe. It's quite complicated. There's 5 steps. There's a lot of detail to it, and it's not something that you're used pre-hospital, generally speaking, and especially not in a mass casualty situation. It's not what they use in the military either, unless you're at a clinic. There's a big difference between military triage and civilian triage. In the military, your priority is to make sure that you don't lose the battle. And so, because if you lose the battle, the potential for people to get wounded is much higher. So what you need to do is prioritize to a certain extent your less wounded people so that you can send them back to continue fighting, which means that we're not always concentrating on that really acutely ill person, depending on what kind of situation we find ourselves in. Whereas that, in this instance, in our imaginary Tour de Victoria situation, you would be focusing on those really acutely injured people first. And it's actually a relatively simple process. There's different algorithms for it. The START is really popular, but even just with the START, you can get like I looked yesterday and there's 15 different versions of this. I like this one because it's pretty simple, pretty easy to use. I'm going to flip back and forth between these two a little. There was a Canadian emergency physician who did this. And I really like this because if you're not used to triage, if you're panicking, this is simplistic and it puts it all in perspective. If they're not breathing, if you try and open that airway and that person's not breathing and you've got far too many casualties to be dealing with, at that point, you respectfully put that person somewhere under a blanket. That's it. We call, those are our pri4s. So you'll hear different terms for this. Your priorities, you've got priority 1, 2, 3, 4. They'll also call them black patients or expectant patients. And then essentially if you've got very abnormal breathing rate, if you're bleeding out, if you're unconscious, that makes you an immediate concern. I like this. If you're not green, red, or black, that makes you yellow. And if you're able to walk away, that makes you a green. Now, that being said, there are a lot of people who can be suffering some very, very serious things who are still able to walk, particularly young people. So you do have to be a little bit careful with that one. You need to be watching those people closely. I'm going to switch back to this quickly in case anyone wanted to kind of have a look at it. So if you follow through the algorithm, it's relatively simplistic in that, are you able to walk? You're green. If you're not able to walk, are you breathing? If I open your airway, are you breathing? If you're not breathing, at that point, we're considering that person dead. If you are breathing, you need to be looked at, but you're not able to move, you're an immediate concern. If your respiratory rate's over 30. Now, this I have a bit of a problem with. Has anyone ever seen a hyperventilating patient? We talked about those non-medical patients. I struggle with this one because in that situation, how many people's resp rate is going to be over 30 based purely off the fact that they're panicking? So you need to have a little bit of clinical sense here. You need to be looking at that person and being able to decide, are they wounded? Has something happened to them? If you're looking in the case of an explosion, you do need to take into account that you can, if you're close enough to an explosion, actually have a pneumothorax from the blast. So you need to be paying attention to the fact that that could be doing it, but you do need to keep in mind that just because someone's breathing really quickly does not necessarily make them that expectant. There's a lot of gut feeling and judgment that goes to triage. They've done a lot of studies trying to find out what kind of triage nurses are better than others, and they haven't come up with anything particularly concrete, but one thing they did find in a couple of studies was that some triage nurses are just better at it than others. There are some people, and those people often describe the gut feeling. We used to play, when I was being trained to be an emerg nurse, a game we called Sick Not Sick. Not a game, I suppose that's also a little bit callous to say, but when a patient would come in, you would have to decide if that patient was sick or not sick before they said a word to you. It's something that's really good to get used to. Do it with your colleague, do it whether you work in a medical field or whether St. John's Ambulance is the one medical thing you do. Make a point of assessing that before anyone even says something to you, because that spidey sense, that gut feeling, whatever you want to call it, is incredibly important, particularly to have practiced, because as we know, what we're able to remember when we panic is muscle memory, things we've done over and over again. If you haven't practiced looking at somebody and being able to judge, is that person sick, is that person not sick, then you're not going to be able to do it in this situation. And so if someone doesn't have a radial pulse, that also makes them immediate. Again, a simple thing, if you have someone who's unconscious or somebody who appears to be bleeding badly, a lot of people, when they panic in a situation where somebody is very, very ill, will go for that radial pulse. Don't check radial pulses. Check carotid pulses. That's it. Again, I know that we cover this in first aid, but you should see how many times even highly trained people in the emergency room, as soon as that person becomes unconscious and everyone gets scared and everybody gets panicky, straight for the radial. Well, you're not going to, as soon as that systolic blood pressure drops below 80, you're not going to get that radial pulse anymore. And then doesn't obey commands. Doesn't obey commands can be difficult as well, because if you think about it, we're talking about our panicking patients. Just because somebody doesn't obey commands, right? That doesn't mean that some people react to situations like this by becoming so frightened that they will sit and they won't move and they won't be able to do anything. They kind of close into their minds. We've got that fight or flight response, but they've kind of expanded that to fight, flight, or freeze, because some people will freeze. Some people will be unable to move. It's something we see in the military with people who get into the middle of gunfights or an incredibly intense situation where they just feel like they become trapped in their own mind. So you do want to try and differentiate between those. Is that what's happening with this person, or has this person got some kind of brain injury? If you can make tags in your gear, what I've seen before, is a really good idea, you can go and get duct tape that is green and red and yellow. Boom, that's how you delineate your different areas, or your different patients. Rip off a piece of that duct tape. It's quick, it's easy. I carry it in my med bag now, because if you're going to do something like this, then all you need is that tape, and it clearly communicates to your other team members where people are, or what people what acuity level you think somebody is. And that's, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here. So one of the other big things that I would point out here, it's something that people forget quite often. Where are you going to put your priority force? Your people who we've decided are not going to make it. I drew attention to the fact that you have to take into consideration you're going to have a big milling crowd of panicking people, and you don't want them stepping on your hurt people. So where are you going to put them? Think about putting them in the shade, somewhere calm, right? Somewhere where they can't go running about. But then you're going to have, if you have a situation, if you have a really serious situation, you may well have bodies. What are you going to do with those people? Step number one, don't put them near your panicking, your non-medical people, the people who are panicking, or for your green patients for that matter. If you start having a lot of people who've passed close to someone who's wounded and they're watching that, you can imagine what that's going to do to them psychologically. You want somewhere where they can be covered, and you want somewhere where they're out of the way, but it should also not be too far away from where you're going to be like where the emergency services will be extricating someone. Now, the chances of, hopefully you won't get stuck in one of these situations for a long period of time, but another very important thing, if you're going to be in this situation for a while, like I know the search and rescue techs that I've worked with have a couple situations where a storm will come in and they won't be able to get picked up by the helicopter right away because they can't get in through the weather. You have to take into consideration that you should not have bodies close to your food, your water, or upwind of you. Little things, again, things that don't necessarily occur to you at the time that you want to think about, kind of assess before the situation happens to you. So if you haven't considered these things before the situation, it's not going to pop into your head, wow, this is actually happening. If you can have someone in charge of each area, one of the really important things we've talked about, the fact that our walking wounded are often sicker than they look. You want someone near them. At least with people who are yellow or red, you've got a good idea that they're sick, that there's something wrong, and you'll be checking them. But for anybody who's seen the ambulatory section of an emergency room, or your, what do they call it in the interior? Fast track. We pile a whole bunch of people, many who don't need immediate medical care, into a room. And there's always one quiet, polite person who's sitting in the corner who's really trying very hard to deteriorate on you. And they get hidden by the people who are up and they're moving and they appear otherwise well. So if you have not a lot of team members, it is important to make sure that somebody is watching that particular group of people. Also, triage, completely fluid, changes every second. Just because you put a green piece of tape on someone or a red piece of tape on somebody, that does not mean that they stay that way. People have a tendency to magically, not magically, but quickly change, particularly when you're not looking or when someone else is taking up your time, as something that you have to take into consideration. You need to be constantly reassessing things. Again, when you get into one of these situations, when you get into an overwhelming situation, people cope by using tunnel vision, going into the black. You need to make sure that you're pulling your head out, taking a step back, looking around you, looking around at what's going on, taking stock of what's happening. In the emergency room, it's so easy to get taken up with one patient. You step into the trauma room and you find yourself in there for an hour. If you're the nurse who's looking after 3 other patients, you're in that trauma room for an hour. That person may well need your help. You may be doing tons of good for them, but you've now left 3 people unsupervised. You're assuming someone else is looking after those people, unless you've very clearly stated to someone else that they are in charge of watching those people for you. You need to be taking a step back every once in a while to assess what is happening to these people. It's something I see a lot of people not do in my workplaces. So again, it's difficult because it's very situation dependent. But if you're in a true mass casualty situation, you're doing CPR, never. That is not the point here. How many people does it take if you start doing CPR on someone? All of them, essentially, unless you've got a great deal of people. If you've got 4 or 5 people, it's going to take that many people to start dealing with somebody who's in cardiac arrest. Making that decision is not easy. It's something I find, this is anecdotal, and I'm going to generalize, I apologize, something physicians, I have noticed, have a very hard time. Part of the Hippocratic Oath is to do no harm. A physician who knows that they can do something for somebody has a lot of trouble stepping back and making the decision to not do that. And sometimes we're in a position where maybe we're not in the position of authority, but you do need to draw someone's attention to that, whether it's the paramedic who's there or a nurse who's there. If somebody else gets really drawn into a situation where they're putting too much time and resources into a patient, it's everyone's responsibility to bring that to their attention. Again, we covered thinking outside the box, using all of our resources, recognizing changing situations, drawing them to someone's attention. The other thing we all like to do is make the assumption that if we've seen it, everyone else has, everyone else knows. In these situations, you cannot assume that. There's a good chance that other people do not know what you know. That's why communication, I have one slide on communication, but there should be a little mini slide in all of these that says communication. It is incredibly important. Clear, concise, loud, pushy communication to the point where you want to make sure that you're heard. That person repeats back to you what they've heard you say. Again, something we think is simple. I say it and you're like, yeah. Oh, I know this. We do not do this in practice enough. It's one of the main failing points that you see, particularly in really chaotic situations, whether it's the trauma room or it's a mass casualty. Even if it's an exercise, mass casualty exercises fall apart because people don't practice this. And then, and this is incredibly important, when you're triaging, you have seconds, maybe minutes, to make a pressured decision based on what information you do have. You don't make wrong decisions. Sometimes you missed a piece of information because of the time pressure you were under. Maybe something changed. The person making triage decisions, you don't ever turn around and tell somebody they were wrong. It's a very harrowing, difficult business to triage, and the level of responsibility you have at any time anyways, but in one of these situations, you're doing the best you can. And the best you can in these situations is all you've got, and it's absolutely enough. This is not the time to start beating yourself up about things. These situations are so traumatic for us. We've seen it a lot with COVID this year, where we felt that we didn't give patients care maybe to the quality that we would have liked to, because the amount of personal protective equipment we had to do, the amount of patients we were dealing with, how few care providers in many instances we And it's very easy to find yourself crawling down dark tunnels in the back of your head. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of the mental health continuum. It goes from green all the way to red. It's something that the military makes use of as well, so as emergency services. Recognizing when you are in mental distress, when you need to talk to somebody. If you've been part of a mass casualty incident, you do not come out of that okay. If you do, you should probably be a little bit concerned about your mental well-being as it is. The whole point is that you need to talk to people, you need to work with your team, you need to be self-aware. You can be okay eventually, but it's traumatic. These things are traumatic. They're traumatic for us. We have a tendency to beat ourselves up, to question the decisions that we've made. And it's not useful to do that to yourselves or to your team members. And you have to remember your team members are thinking that, and you tell them they're doing a good job, or check in with them. We've had multiple instances during exercises where I've had medical staff, medics, actually become so dehydrated that they've fainted or had to get IV fluids because they've forgotten to drink. COVID's another good example with us all wearing the masks. You don't get to drink water nearly enough. You don't think about it. And in an emergency situation like this, you go 12 hours without peeing, eating, or drinking. Again, right back to the very beginning, if you are the resource here, you are the thing that we don't have enough of. If you're not looking after yourself, you're essentially losing us resources. So you need to be doing self-care. Those are really, these are the three big points. Number one, keep yourself safe. Scene safety, self-care, understanding that you are a resource. You need to be looking after yourself as much as you're looking at the patients. As well as the fact that this is incredibly chaotic. The entire point of this is that you're not going to have it on lockdown. When I do mass casualty exercises now, I'm usually the one who's in charge of them, and I think it terrifies the poor medics. I usually start the day, instead of going slowly, by surprising them with a mass casualty exercise when they're not expecting it. And I'll throw 20 casualties at them and overwhelm them. And then purposely, people shout. We get sergeants shouting and making loud noises and pushing and causing great deals of stress. And afterwards, I explain that I've set them up for failure. You will always succeed and always fail in a mass casualty exercise. The whole point is, if mass casualties, you can't succeed. You can't have it all go the way you want. But that being said, that means that the best you can do is the best. And so you have succeeded, if that makes sense. Did I? First aid. I kind of skipped over this a little bit just because you guys get medical training. I'm not entirely sure what your scope of practice is. I didn't want to get into details too much of specific medical interventions. If anyone's interested afterwards, so I also have taken the TCCC course, which is the Tactical Combat Casualty Care course. I know a little bit about, all your immediate, like your needle decompressions and your tourniquet use, and I've got some good information about that, but I didn't want to kind of get into the weeds with that, especially if I was going to be overwhelming people. So we can definitely talk about that after if we want to get into some first aid specifics. What I would say is that the most common cause of death for natural disasters, and then often in mass casualty incidents, is people bleeding out. And it is really easy to stop a bleed. I don't know if anyone's seen the Stop the Bleed campaign. They've got very, very simplistic teaching, basically put pressure on it, hold pressure on it. And you don't need to be trained to do that. That's when you get that bystander, have them take their shirt off, jam that shirt in the wound, put direct pressure on that bleed, and you instruct them very clearly that they are to put pressure, they're to make sure that they're not seeing any more bleeding, and that they are not to take that pressure off, even if it looks like the bleeding stopped. It doesn't take a lot of resources to do that, and it's one of the most important things that we often forget about. To be the person standing there, I've been the person standing there holding either the artery or the leg or the arm or whatever it is that's bleeding, and you feel a little bit unimportant or like you're not helping because you're standing there just holding it while everyone else is racing around doing other things. But if you let that go, if you're not continuing to hold pressure on it, if somebody turns around or gets distracted, that's when a really easy intervention isn't being done and you're potentially losing your patients. I have managed, I always talk too quickly, I've managed to kind of get my way all the way through that presentation. One of the stories I was going to tell, last story that I found kind of interesting, in Vietnam, the number one cause of death when they have, I can't remember what they're called right now, when they the tropical storms, is drowning. And usually people drown in like 3 feet of water. And it's because nobody can swim. They have the longest coastline of any country. Very few people in Vietnam are taught to swim. And people from emergency providers, including paramedics, police, fire, and laymen, will go out, try and save people who are in the water, and they themselves will become victims, and they themselves will drown. And so Nha Trang, the city that I went to when I was to play with the military, one of the biggest things, we went and we had conferences, we talked about what resources can we provide, what teaching can we do, and what it came out with was, can you teach us swimming lessons? Like, we taught a bunch of their paramedics to swim because they couldn't. And it's something that simple, and it's a really good example just of, if you can't swim, don't be the person getting in the water to try and save someone, because you becoming a casualty can so easily complicate a situation that didn't need to be more complicated. You've got 2 casualties now instead of 1. It's incredibly difficult not to help someone, but if you're going to double the situation, then take that into mind before you make a move. I think, again, I'm going to get into anecdotal stories and start getting very tangential. If you keep going, Nick, you can probably stop me now.
That was fantastic, Bobby. Thank you. I've got a small bank of questions here that I've been taking from everyone over the last little while. A couple of them are notes from myself as well. So I'm just going to start at the top. So we're kind of going back to stuff that you were talking about maybe 40 minutes ago, half hour ago, and work my way down. I had a couple of notes from myself, just from some of my own experience doing larger crowd events and like large scale events with St. John. One thing I wanted to note, and we've actually run into problems with this here in Victoria for specifically Canada Day, is the police quite regularly will ask us if we can position our ambulance in certain ways to serve as a blockade across roads in the event of a truck attack. They actually ask us to position our ambulance across the road. And I want to just encourage everyone that if your local security agency, whether it's the police, the armed forces, or whatever, is asking you to do something like that, that's a decision that needs to go through your command structure, because that has the potential to really impact your ability to deliver care if there is any kind of attack or event like that.
I actually do have a really good point that brings to mind, Nick. The police in Saanich and Victoria, I don't know about the RCMP, but Saanich and Victoria have been taught recently a course that's very similar to TCCC, and they're carrying the gear on them now. So all officers will have field dressings and tourniquets, and in one case I even saw someone with a needle D. So if you have someone who requires a tourniquet or requires that like immediate care, the police are trained in that and they have the gear for it.
We can do tourniquets as well, like quite easily within scope for us, but needle decompressions are not. But yeah, it's fantastic that they have that. A lot of the cops carry Narcan kits as well too, for what that's worth. But it's another.
They put intranasal Narcan. I was lucky.
Some of them carry the injection ones as well. The nasal ones are supposedly for themselves because they don't want to have sharps. But I have seen a few of them. Sorry, I'm just taking a note on another question here. 2 more questions actually. With the injection Narcan as well. Just for your own benefit, Bobby, if you're interested in a really good example of fairly extreme triage, there's an author named Takashi Nagai, who's a fantastic Japanese author who's dead now, but he was a radiologist at Nagasaki General Hospital on the day the bomb went off, and he was one of two, I think, maybe three surviving physicians less than 800 meters from ground zero, and he actually wrote a book about the first 48 hours. I believe the first 48 hours book was The Bells of Nagasaki. He wrote quite a few literary works, and I can't quite remember. I think it was The Bells of Nagasaki. But he talks about having between himself 2 or 3 physicians, and I think they had about a dozen nurses and maybe a dozen orderlies. And by the end of their first day, 2,500 patients for that group to manage. And if you want to talk about, triage and stratification of wound management, it's written as a pacifist manifesto, if you will, but it certainly provides some insight. We had Patricia Brewer noted that if you can settle them down, you can use walking worried to help out with easy things and assign someone to help settle them down and utilize them. So you can maybe take one person who's a little bit less escalated, get that person to de-escalate a second person, and then put them to work. I really like that idea. It's very dependent, I think, on how escalated they are, but
it keeps them busy too, though. What I'll often do, I have a tendency, if I'm honest, to do it sometimes with our inebriated patients, particularly after Canada Day or Halloween or festivals. You'll have somebody who's had a little too much acid or mushrooms or whatever it is they've gotten into, and then you've got a whole big group of people who are tripping out or drunk for whatever reason, and I've had them, it's like, okay, you need to make sure these guys are okay while I step away, and it gives them something to focus on, gives them something to do, and they'll kind of keep themselves safe, keep themselves busy. If you specifically tell someone to, this is your job now, like, this is your responsibility, they'll often stick to it and do it, and you'll give them something to think about besides the fact that they're
panicking. We have Rebecca Oram asks, she says she's curious about when the walking worried want to get involved but are too psychologically traumatized or not well trained but insist on getting involved. She's been taught avoidance techniques to assign busy work, but she's curious if there are other approaches to unhelpful bystanders. You kind of answered that in terms of giving them busy work, but do you have any other thoughts on getting rid of them?
There's always something, you can always find something safe for them to do. Like if they're not trained, find something, even if it seems kind of pointless to you, but something to keep them busy. Like it's kind of silly, but I think of my demented patients in the emergency room who cannot stop moving and are incredibly busy and are very confused. You pop down a big pile of washcloths and they'll sit there and ask them to fold them, tell them it's really important they do. They'll sit there and they'll fold those washcloths for hours, right? The same kind of thing. I think you could probably take someone, I don't think trying to get rid of them or trying to tell them to go away is, especially if they're insisting on helping, I'm willing to bet that's never going to be super successful. So how I was talking about delineating things with tape? Give them that duct tape and be like, I need this whole area outlined in yellow tape. You know what I mean? Like that's big. Just because they're not trained doesn't mean that they're not going to be able to do that. And then it gives them something to concentrate on. Yeah,
absolutely. Moving on, Mike Hoskinson noted with the discussion on sick or not sick. Mike's one of our physicians. He noted that sick or not sick is the essence of pediatric care. Certainly falls into that pediatric assessment triangle, which we've talked about in the past. We actually have a textbook, and you might not know this, Mike, but some of the senior St. John members actually do use this in terms of developing a philosophy for how we train our members. This is actually, it's like an $80 book for this tiny little thing, but it's actually a really, really good philosophy of, at the end of the day, your patient assessment can boil down to being a binary a lot of the time. And putting it in those terms can be really helpful. So it's not just MCI stuff, we're sick or not sick. It's also pediatrics. It's also just general care. in a pre-hospital and probably also in an in-hospital environment.
I don't know about everybody else, but I definitely find pediatrics intimidating, and those guys can go about looking not sick for a really long time, right up until they suddenly and disastrously look sick in front of you. Adults have a tendency to not hide it as well as kids do. Kids will surprise you. But my tendency, particularly with triaging, is to always be more careful about children. You have to assume that they're sicker than they look. But if you've got more experience and you're better at it, but if you're not, or you're uncomfortable, like myself, even at the general, you'll generally see us be a lot more careful with kids.
Yeah. Andrew Finnegan noted that with one of his agencies, I'm not sure he said I'm not sure which agency it was previously, whether it was Forces or St. John, but different tarps, different colored tarps to sort groups and just roll out the whole tarp and drop it. To me, I've seen that done before. The downside is that tarps are actually fairly bulky, and they don't actually provide for a huge amount of space, and they don't allow for scalability. So, they are certainly a thing that I've seen deployed, and I think they were even in some of Bobby's pictures. But
it keep people off the ground, which would be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely, especially when it starts to, if it's an overnight sort of thing, and the ground is going to get dew covered and all that. But I just wanted to talk really fast, Bobby. You talked a little bit about how triaging is not wrong, or you can't be wrong in triaging, especially in an MCI situation. I wanted to touch on this a little bit because something we note that a lot of, especially our newer, younger members who are newer to pre-hospital care, often focus on is, or often over-focus on is, they'll spend too much time trying to be absolutely perfect and make sure they get it absolutely right. And no, I have to figure this out. And especially if you've got 2, 3, 4 patients who've got multiple priorities, or more patients, goodness, sometimes you just have to make a decision and move forward and be okay with, what, in retrospect, maybe the scissor isn't the best decision, but we did something, we improved the situation. And as long as you're trending in that improved direction, that's a big thing. But it is something that we struggle with a lot with our new people.
New nurses are the same way. CTAS, the system that we use in the hospital, is quite complicated, and it can have liability repercussions if you do triage someone and you can't prove why you triage them that way. Then it can actually lead to some legal issues, and they've created things like apps for it. So these poor new nurses will be sitting on their phone looking at the app trying to find out exactly what CTAS level that person is. But if you think about it, the longer you take to triage someone, the longer it takes to get them to care. How much good are you doing them? Because it's so fluid, the moment you triage someone, the second you've done triaging them, re-triaged, you can change that. The person who gets them can change it. On their way to the place they're going, the person can change it. Just because you've done it doesn't mean that it's set in stone. And I think that's what scares a lot of people, is they think that's now attached forever, but you have to keep using clinical judgment.
Mike Hoskinson just said this, but I'm going to bump it forward a little bit. He said he liked your advice to stay out of the black. That was the best take-home message of the night for him, and I would agree with that. It's a challenge too. Like, we all do it. We all tunnel vision at some point.
It's a coping mechanism. It's not that I suggest you don't do it. It's that I suggest you recognize what you have and then remove yourself from that situation. Because everyone's gonna. You just have to know you're doing it and be able to give your head a shake. My old instructor would say, pull your head out of your ass every once in a while, because you are going to do that. It's just a natural situation when you get panicky.
Absolutely. Kyra's asked, can you comment on record keeping in an MCI situation? Does it just go out the window, or are there specific strategies for MCIs? Now, I can talk a fair bit about this with St. John, but maybe I'll let Bobby.
It's difficult. I don't want to give bad advice, but at the same time, we talk about using your resources. You do want to chart things. You want to write things down. If you've got those tags, the triage tags, it's helpful because it's actually on the patient. It stays with the patient. But if it comes right down to the fact that you've got 3 people and 50 wounded, what are your priorities? what are the decisions you need to make about that? So what do you need to chart? I would say pick out the things that you have to, which is where that tape comes in handy, because you need to somehow mark the person as how ill they are, what you've triaged. Another big one is tourniquet use. Since you guys can use tourniquets, one of the things that be tourniquet happy. The military has proven, especially with Afghanistan and Iraq, that tourniquets have far better outcomes and that limbs can last much longer than we previously thought with those tourniquets on. If you put a tourniquet on though, and that tourniquet clothing falls over it and people don't know it's there, that is an issue. So that's something you really want to record. And what we do often in the military, if you've got a black Sharpie, is you write a time on the person's forehead. And the black written on the forehead will attract the attention of emergency services that person has a tourniquet, and that's how you know what time that tourniquet's on. Make it obvious, make it big, make it obvious. But as far as minute charting goes, it depends your situation. Like if you have 5 patients, it's a little different. You have 50 and 3 people. Do you want one of your people to be busy writing things down?
Something that I've certainly done in the past, and it's easier with St. John than it is with my day job with BC EHS. With St. John, we're still using paper patient care records. And if you have enough pens, you can give all of the green and yellow patients a pen and a piece of paper and tell them to start charting their own demographic stuff, at least. You write down, fill in your name and your address, and if you have your ID card handy, jot that, and it can provide a bit of a distraction for the yellows, depending on how yellow they are, if you will. And it can certainly be a great way to entertain and keep busy the greens for a while as well.
Yeah.
In terms of broader documentation, I think it's a do what you can. And I think, Bobby, you nailed it. Is certainly within St. John, we do have to generate some degree of paperwork, but it shouldn't be your priority. Your patient care should always be your priority, and fill in the paper after.
Surprised how much you can remember after the fact. If you see nurses in the trauma room, often we're charting what's actually happening and not charting the history. We'll go back and chart it, like whatever you can do to remember what it is, whatever memory technique. Another thing to get used to, like I can remember the last 3 or 4 sets of vital signs I've taken. It's how many times are you in the middle of taking vital signs when somebody does something that you need to go running and attend to, and you haven't written those vital signs down. You have to find a way to file that away and remember it.
Yeah. I always tell my students they should be able to commit to memory their patient's current set of vitals at any given time and be able to parrot that back. I mean, it's
a good exercise. My instructor used to make me do that, and it was handy. Especially if someone terrifying comes and goes, what are the last set of vital signs, and makes you repeat it. Like if you get used to keeping that information, it helps with your memory.
Moving on, you're talking about eating and drinking and sort of providing care for yourself. I wanted to hammer on this because we actually do, St. John does a lot of longer duties. Like when we go out to Canada Day or Rock the Shores back when it was happening, it's a big music festival here in Victoria for those who aren't around here, or the Saanich Fall Fair. It's not uncommon for some of our members to have 16 or 18-hour days, and we have had multiple incidences where people have developed sun or heat exposure, have failed to adequately hydrate themselves, or have failed to adequately feed themselves, and have actually on multiple occasions ended up becoming patients of their own colleagues. It's one of the few things that I'll say we will actually judge you a little bit for, but please don't please don't do that. It's a really, really important thing to make sure you're packing enough food, water, and weather appropriate, whether it's a jacket or sunscreen or hat or whatever, weather appropriate clothing.
Buddy checks are really important too. You might forget to do it for yourself, but we're good at caring for other people, better at caring for other people than we are for ourselves. Be paying attention to your buddy and don't be afraid to poke them and say, hey, you haven't had a drink of water. We often jokingly in some of these situations talk about it, particularly the guys, if the guys are going to take a pee, have a check at what color their urine is. You're supposed to buddy check. If someone is getting super dehydrated, no, sit down, drink water, like look after each other.
My own practice, and this is just my own thing. but when I'm at work with the ambulance service, every time I go to a hospital, I drink one large cup of water before I leave. I go to the bathroom, but I make sure that I'm getting, especially like we're having a bit of a heat wave here in Victoria right now. Probably not a heat wave by Ontario standards, guys. It's like 30 degrees here. Whoa. But you know, it is something that takes some degree of conscious effort. We had, where'd we go? Rebecca Oram had a very interesting thing that generated a little bit of discussion here, saying they've had issues in the past with people identifying themselves as doctors, and then it turns out that they were predators, and they've been advised to ask for ID from people claiming to be physicians. How much screening can or should be done in mass casualty situations? And then she clarified that I guess there was, sounds like an incident in which someone who was identified later as a sexual predator was trying to get access to minors by claiming to be a physician or a healthcare provider.
It's terrifying.
That's, yeah, I don't, that's a challenge just on my end from a St. John point of view, because most physicians, and certainly not paramedics, we don't have like an ID card that we carry around in our wallet that says, you know, paramedic. I have an ID card that's like clipped onto my uniform, but you know, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Bobby. I don't have much.
It's difficult because, again, it's situation dependent. If there's 3 of you and 50 badly wounded casualties, unfortunately, that's not something I think you're going to get a chance to spend a ton of time on. If you're looking at 5 casualties and 3 of you and you're feeling overwhelmed and someone comes up and offers that they're a doctor, you have to keep in mind that not everyone, there's a huge difference, for instance, between emergency room staff and ward staff. If a paramedic came up to me and said he was a paramedic, in certain situations, that particularly pre-hospital situations, you're actually be a lot better off with your paramedic than you are with your doctor. Is your doctor, you know, what does he do? What kind of doctor is he? There's so many, and we're used to working in the hospital. I am not, with the exception, if I didn't have the pre-hospital training, like an emergency nurse is not as good to you pre-hospital as a paramedic is, because that's where they're used to working. Nurses are used to having all their equipment in their nice, clean, brightly lit hospital. That's why we get cranky when IVs aren't started, is because we don't understand why the IV wasn't started, because for us, everything stays still all the time and it's always brightly lit. It doesn't occur to them that, you know, it's dark and bumpy and things are moving. So as far as trusting people who come up and give you credentials, you always have to be in charge. The same way, like when you're doing CPR in your first aid class, if somebody else comes up, even if they have maybe more medical experience than you, you don't give up being in charge just because someone shows up and says, I've got this kind of experience. That's one of that verbal communication as who's in charge. If someone offers help, you're still in charge of that situation. That's still your casualty care collection point, right? That person's helping you.
Yeah. I've run into, and Bobby, we actually see this moderately frequently in the field as paramedics, when people will self-identify themselves as other healthcare professionals, and quite routinely, and by routinely I mean probably every couple of weeks, I will have someone tell me, I'm a nurse, and they're wearing their healthcare aid, which I think is a 2 or 3 week course. They're wearing their healthcare aid ID badge on them, and they say, I'm a nurse. And if you're not primed to ask, really, are you a registered nurse, an LPN, or something else, and actually ask that question, you can think that you've got someone with, 4, 6, 7 years of education and a great deal of clinical background talking to you, when in fact you have someone who has much less experience. Mike Hoskinson, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here. Mike Hoskinson, who's one of our physician members, but he notes that he's a retired nuclear medicine physician, and that if you have a nuclear emergency, he's on it. But I've certainly had people self-identify themselves to me as, I'm a nurse. And in one case, years ago, I actually had someone who turned out to be an extended care nurse, who was trying to hold spinal on a patient. They were kneeling on the poor female patient's ponytail while lifting their head off the ground, and the patient was screaming at them to let go of them, but they were convinced that they were helping by holding spinal. And so it is really, really important to be clear about the qualifications. Most physicians, most of them, maybe not all of them, but the vast majority are pretty good about saying, I'm a doctor, I'm a radiologist, I haven't touched a live patient in 25 years, but I'm here if I can help. And, that makes it a lot easier, but it is really, really critical to be clear on people's.
And I think I would volunteer the information, especially having worked, I spend a great deal of my working life with medics, between military, search and rescue. If someone comes running up and says, I'm a nurse, I will be the first to volunteer the information that outside the hospital, that's not necessarily your biggest resource. I don't want to step on any of my colleagues' toes, but at the same time, that's not what we're trained to do, right? And 6 years of education, what 6 years? Like I would definitely say that 6 years of education's got nothing on 12 years of experience.
Yep, I fully agree.
Anytime someone gets themselves involved, working in the reserves, it's quite hard because you have a ranking system in the military, and so you're meant to go by the ranking system. But in the reserves, everyone's got a civvy job, and so sometimes your corporal is actually, a doc, and you don't know that. So giving people the chance to prove themselves is one of the biggest things. If someone new comes in and offers to help, keep half an eye on them, be involved in what they're doing, and watch them do it well before you trust them to do something. Because there's nothing that someone can say to me, I'm a doctor, I'm a nurse, I'm a medic, don't make me think, you're competent. You have to see that from somebody.
It's worth also, and this is for the paramedics in the group particularly, but it's worth also remembering that when you're on scene with other agencies, especially volunteer fire departments and volunteer search and rescue groups, or St. John, that you might not know the background and qualifications of the people that are wearing those other uniforms as well. We've certainly had cases where I've been working for BCHS, and I'm thinking of one particular individual who works out on the Sandwich Peninsula, who I won't name, all positive experiences, but one of the local emergency physicians is also a volunteer firefighter. And so, we've certainly had incidents before where, some I got my 6-month PCP qualification, shows up and starts to maybe be a little bit condescending or bossy to some of the fire department guys. And you don't necessarily know what resource you're wasting there as well. So it's not necessarily it's not always people overstating their qualifications. Sometimes people just quietly be doing their thing and staying out of the way. So do be clear on what folks can bring to the table. Nicole Renkema, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Nicole, noted that what she's found with triage is that the most high ranking or the most trained person is not always the right person to run the triage or to be the lead in a triage situation. As Bob was saying, training is huge. I fully agree with that. Very often your most highly trained individual is more useful doing patient care, and someone a couple of notches down from that is maybe, but still clinically competent, is maybe the best person to be in triage. But it can be really situationally dependent, depends on patient volumes and what's actually going on with your patient.
In the American Navy, all their dentists are trained to triage, because in a mass casualty incident, your dentist isn't going to be any good. So they train them to triage so that they can do that, so that it doesn't take away from people who are able to help in a mass casualty incident. So all the mass casualty scenarios we did on the ship, the dentist would come in and triage.
That's fantastic. I like it. Nicole also noted that intranasal Narcan is now part of level 1 courses. I guess that's OFA level 1 courses is going to be much more common. I think one of the barriers to that, Nicole, is that the intranasal stuff is like $70 a dose or something like that, whereas the injection stuff is delivered for free. So we are seeing more of it on the street, the intranasal stuff, but I'm not sure if it's going to be flooding the street super soon. Trevor from Division 597 said, when calling 911 for an MCI, you can use a chalet report Chalets and mnemonic for casualties, hazards, access, location, emergency, and type. I think that sounds fantastic. If you were able to attend last week's talk on behind the scenes at dispatch, David would have talked a lot about, David did talk a lot about how the dispatchers have a certain set of questions that they have to get through. So by all means, use your chalet report, but please let the dispatcher ask all of their questions first and get through their algorithm, because if you try and short circuit their algorithm, it actually just slows everything down and actually breaks the dispatch process. Ken Swain asks, Bobby, is your training based on the incident command system, or are you using something different?
I've seen a couple of different things. Incident command system is definitely a common one. It depends who your incident command system is, what they use through the hospital. It's mostly what they use in the military with their own specific tweaks. What I saw on deployment was not. It was a gigantic schmozzle in some cases. That was one of the new things. We came with a lot of information about kind of the disaster cycle and the incident command system, and that was new in Vietnam specifically.
I'm skipping ahead a couple because there's a couple of redundant things here that we've already sort of covered. Mike Dussault, going back to the nasal Narcan. Mike Dussault, and this is something worth noting, wanted to note the intranasal Narcan dose is 4 milligrams, not 0.4. It is 4 milligrams. A lot of people maybe don't necessarily appreciate that. So if you're seeing someone getting a dose of nasal Narcan, I've had a pharmacist tell me that about 50% of that is bioavailable fairly quickly. So it works out to about an onboarding of about 2.0 milligrams, fairly fast, but something to keep in mind. Rebecca Oram asks, I learned about arousal regulation in sports psychology. Are there any good, concise resources for first responders? That's a really good question. I really like that question. I have a couple of thoughts, but Bobby, what do you have to add to that?
We do the training for that as well. That's military specific. And I'm trying to think of a resource that's not military specific, and I apologize off the top of my head because I get a lot of that through the Canadian Armed Forces, but they're all specific to the forces. So I can't think of anything that would be readily available. There's a war, I believe, that's a really interesting view into why people react in certain ways, but it's more of like an interesting read than it is an actual resource.
Certainly from our point of view, we learn a little bit about this going through paramedic training and also through our ongoing mental health supports. There's a couple things that I can suggest. I mean, they're not necessarily resources per se, but box breathing is I believe, a technique that originated with the military, but it is a process, and we use this to try and de-escalate our excited patients, actually, but also really, really helps to sort of mitigate high stress situations for responders. And it's a process. If you just Google box breathing, you can watch all kinds of videos on this, but you basically take 4 seconds to breathe in, hold it for 4 seconds, take 4 seconds to breathe out, hold your exhaled breath for 4 seconds and hold it out, take 4 seconds to breathe in, and keep doing that. And it really helps bring down a lot of your psychological arousal, your physiological arousal. Something else that I actually do myself, and it can be situation dependent, but sometimes a little bit of mindfulness, maybe not meditation would be a strong word, but you know, if you have an opportunity to take 60 seconds to do any mindfulness exercises, if you've been trained on how to do those, can be really, really helpful. When I'm heading into big calls, and we sort of have an indication beforehand that that's what's going on, I'll often take 60 seconds in the ride or on the ride to the call to do that myself, and just close my eyes and focus on a few things. And I find it really helps bring everything down several notches.
I know earlier, one of the big things is remaining calm yourself. Those people can being aware that that's what they're experiencing, and being aware that they can have an effect on you, and you remaining calm and you leading well will often have people feeling more comfortable and feeling like they can follow you. Allowing them to arouse you is one of the big downfalls.
Very much. I sorry, someone just unmuted their TV there. Something else that was taught to me, and I don't do this myself, but it's something that I've taught some of my students to do, and they've told me that it's very helpful, is to literally just stop for 10 seconds and assess your situation. It's very easy to get into, especially if you're dealing with multiple patients in a high stress situation. Like 1, 2, you know, you're off to your next thing. 10 seconds is not going to change, even with your sickest patient. 10 seconds is not going to change much. And taking a few seconds to stand back, take a deep breath. Okay, I have a 50-year-old female patient with a broken arm. I have a 35-year-old patient with bilateral broken arm. And just do a reassessment like that can be a really helpful tool. Mike Hoskinson notes that I learned in an ATLS course back in the day that no matter how bad things seem, there is always time to step back and reassess. You know, I mean, please don't take half an hour to do that. But you know, it can be a useful thing. Nicole Renkema, one last ad here. Nicole Renkema added that a trick they use with Mind Rescue and also competition first aid is to put tape on your clothing, and you can write shorthand notes on the tape. I think that might get a little bit confusing if you're dealing with an MCI with many patients, but I mean, you could probably put tape on the patients and write a few notes on the duct tape on the patients as well.
I've seen people put it on their clothing so that they can write, and then once they're done, they pull it off, put it on the patient it's pertinent to, move to the next patient. Hang on.
Yep. We're just going to pause for 1 second here, folks. Oh, Bobby's back. I think this is going to be our last question here. Patricia Brewer from 518 is asking, it's an interesting point that Nicole brought up, that the highest ranking person is not always the best one to take control. What do you do if someone who's outranking you, and I mean, maybe this is a bit different in the military than with St. John, is trying to take over a scene when you've sort of got things in hand? I don't have a great answer for that other than to try and have a discussion with them, but.
I find that blunt honesty is really useful in these situations, particularly when you don't have enough time. If that's what they're trying to do, clarify with them. I'm sorry, sir. Are you trying to take charge of the situation? You know, I've been here since the beginning, and I have this and this, which is why I think I should remain in charge of the situation. Can you please talk to me about this in a minute? You don't have to be impolite about it. It depends. It does depend on, I mean, as you say, in the military, it can be different, but as I was explaining before, in the reserves, we all have such different civilian jobs. Somebody outranking you might not have the experience to be in the leadership position, but this is also not the time to have that argument. Sometimes having the person in charge who's maybe not the absolute best to be in charge, but as long as things are happening and you can you can do what you need to do, maybe this isn't the time to be questioning that. You know, maybe this isn't, if someone takes charge, if someone came up to you and just said they were a doctor and you didn't know them from anybody else, it's different. But if someone's taking charge and they maybe don't have as much experience as you, this might not be the time to haggle over little points of who's the actual best for this. Do the best with what you've got and make it go. But like you were saying with triage, taking all that time to try and make something perfect versus just making a decision, going with it. A lot of the time you just have to make that decision and go with it.
I fully agree. I was laughing, Bobby, because you suggesting blunt honesty is
I've been known to be honest on occasion. I've started apologizing after all the traumas we have in the trauma room to anyone whose feelings that I have hurt. Just assuming that I have hurt somebody's. That's what I mean, though. In these situations, you can't be too blunt. because again, not everyone's seeing the same thing you're seeing, not everyone's thinking the same thing you're seeing, and this isn't the time for hurt feelings. That's something else I think maybe to take into consideration. If someone's trying to take charge, or if someone's not doing quite the job you want, or something like that, unless they're endangering the patient, unless they're directly endangering one of your patients, this is not the time to spend any of your concentration on the niceties, what they said to you, or how they're acting, or if they're not doing it quite the way that you should. This is the time to let things like that go. You do not have enough resources and concentration for that to be bugging you at the moment. Assess that later. Put your feelings aside, because this is when you're saving people.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. And you know what? I think you'll in my own experience, the vast majority of professionals, and I've been on both sides of this, the vast majority of professionals, if you say, you know what, Bobby, I got to step in. I need to take over on this right now. We're going to move you over here. For whatever reason, if it's because you weren't doing a job well enough or something, most people are pretty good about that. I've never really had that, especially in the moment, really be a negative experience. You know, that's certainly, you know, I've certainly, you know, had to juggle people around on scene before when someone was, you know, maybe a bit newer and was struggling with a skill, or, you know, wasn't bagging well, is a great example, like that, especially for our members who don't get a chance to do that a lot. You know, there might be an opportunity to try and correct it a little bit at first, and if not, it's time to tap out and do a learning moment later on. But I've never had anyone, you know, get really worked up. But there's a difference between being rude and being to the point and professional.
One thing in my position, particularly, I think as a nurse, I've never had issues with someone trying to take charge from me, or with me trying to take charge from somebody else. What I have seen is multiple physicians in a one patient scenario. So I've seen, I've had a lot of issue when you have, it's not when you have difference in rank, it's when you have the same rank. What if you have three people the same rank all trying to be in charge? And what if they're not communicating with each other? What if all three of them have given you something to do and you can't do all three of those things? You've got three people doing things, three people in charge. Those three people in charge have given you separate things that are not gonna help. What I've personally multiple times been involved with is a situation where I have to say, okay, stop. I don't know how many people are familiar with Rob Q. It's one of his favorite things and it works really well. Just say, okay, stop. Catches people's attention. And at that point, what you need to do is point out, I need to know who's in charge. And there's a difference between being impolite and being direct. I need to know who's in charge here, and it needs to be one person. And it is your job to make sure that's happening. That's the other thing. Just because those people are in charge and you're witnessing it all crumbling around you, especially in these chaotic situations, it is as much your responsibility as anyone else. You could be the lowest person on the totem pole, but if you're seeing something go wrong, if it is jeopardizing your patient, it is your duty to raise your voice and say something about it.
We actually run into this fairly frequently on CAR when there's two ALS members, two advanced life support paramedics, and one person's attending and the other person's also trying to be helpful by resource managing, and they're both trying to resource manage and giving different directions to people. And you know, you have one person say, can you do this? And then the other person says, can you do, not having heard the first person ask for a crew member to do something. And now all of a sudden I'm getting double tasked and I'm not going to be able to do both, you know, and that can be you know, similar to what you suggested with two physicians who aren't maybe.
Good use of closed loop communication as well. If you're saying, yes, I will go do that while somebody's asking you to do something different, it shows them that you're already doing something. If you're verbalizing back to the person giving you directions what it is you're doing, it attracts the attention to the fact that that's what you're doing.
Bobby, I think we've run out of questions. And I'll give the group one more opportunity to throw any more at us, but there's folks from quite far away. I see folks from Kamloops, I believe a few folks from Ontario, Nanaimo, all saying thank you for an educative session. Thank you for a great presentation. Thanks for being awesome. Great info. Good discussion and so on and so forth. So if nobody else has any more questions, I think we'll call it an evening, guys. And please, please, if you do, now is the time to throw stuff up in the group chat. We'll leave it open for another minute or so. While we're doing that, thank you so much, Bobby, for your time tonight. I'm going to, I forgot to send you the slides to plug our social media stuff. Oh, I got a thank you from Penticton as well. For those of you who are interested, you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or YouTube. Just search for SJAVicBC, SJAVICBC. We're not super active with our social media stuff right now just because a lot of our operations are shut down for COVID, but if people are interested, they're able to follow us. Patricia Brewer from 518 saying thank you for your service, Bobby. And yeah, if Michael Dussault says thank you, ma'am.
Thanks, Mike.
But yeah, if we don't have anyone else putting any questions in the chat here, we'll call it evening. Thank you so much, Bobby.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Super. We'll have you again too. We'll take as much of your presentations as we can possibly suck out of you. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Bobby. That was awesome.
Not a problem.
And on that note, thank you from Division 910 in Ontario. Yeah, I'm gonna shut the group chat down here, guys, and log us out. And I hope everyone has a wonderful evening. Oh, is that Andy trying to ask something?
We got to partake in a emergency exercise at Canoe a few years ago. Had 120 casualties. It was scheduled to, from the time they started to the time they end, was supposed to last 4 hours. We actually called it at 4.5, and everybody's looking around going, well, what happened? Why did they call it? And we're going, you guys have been at this for 4.5 hours. If we don't stop now, we're going to have to start cycling people through rehab to refresh the people that are attending. They did not realize they had been there for 4.5 hours. But the other part is I do have the disc from that exercise, and you can watch the exercise from it's about an hour and a half, and you can watch it from the start to the end, and you can critique it because you can see some of the things that went right and some of the things that were going right, but you could also see some of the very simple mistakes that got made in it. So it's actually a good reference to, if you've got a rainy night and you want and nothing else to do, I can get you a copy and you can plug it in and say, okay, what's gone wrong here and what went right.
Yeah, I think it's Andy raises a good point. Losing awareness of time can be a very real issue, but maintaining an awareness of your own fatigue, your own hydration, your own nutrition needs, and stuff like that. I mean, it's unlikely, knock on wood, it's unlikely that that any of us are going to be directly involved in a major disaster scale MCI anytime soon. Most of the MCIs that we encounter are in the low hundreds of patients, or likely to encounter would be in the low hundreds of patients and stuff like that, right? So, I'm gonna go ahead and end the presentation here, folks. Thank you so much, Bobby, and Margaret says, don't tap Kamloops out. We're used to large disasters. You guys do seem to have more than your fair share these days, to be fair. But yeah, we're going to end the presentation. Thank you again, everyone. I will have both last week's and this week's presentations up on YouTube, hopefully later tonight or tomorrow. A little bit of a delay last week, just a busy week in my world. But yeah, thanks so much, folks. Have a great night.
Hey, Nick.